He was just a boy when the lights of Hollywood first found him, a young face that mirrored the charm, wit, and promise of Will Smith himself. For one fleeting moment, he was the future. Millions saw him on screen in The Fresh Prince of Bel-Air, laughing, running, glowing with the unfiltered innocence of youth. And then, as if swallowed by the very shadow of fame, he vanished. For more than 2 decades, no one knew where Floyd Roger Myers Jr. had gone. The child actor who once embodied the brightest version of the American dream simply disappeared from the story. Until now, because just days ago, that story came to a devastating end. Floyd Roger Myers Jr., the boy who once played young Will Smith, was found dead in his Maryland home. He was only 42, 3 heart attacks in 3 years, each one closer than the last, each one whispering a truth the world never stopped to hear. He'd spent his final years far from the cameras, building a quiet life, raising 4 children, and helping other men heal from their wounds, as if trying to mend something inside himself that fame had broken long ago. Behind the laughter of a sitcom, behind the childhood glow, there was a man who had been forgotten by the industry that once embraced him. And in that silence, he built a life that few ever saw and that ended far too soon. What really happened to the boy who once carried the spark of Will Smith's legacy? Why did the promise fade into tragedy? The truth, as always, lies somewhere between the light and the dark. Long before his name became a whisper in Hollywood's forgotten corridors, Floyd Roger Myers Jr. was a dream in motion, a child of Washington, D.C., raised in a modest home that pulsed with rhythm, faith, and ambition. Born on the 17th of August, 1983, he carried the kind of light that directors search for and the kind of innocence the camera loves. He wasn't born into fame. He stepped into it by accident. His mother, a single parent at the time, often said Floyd had a smile that made every room brighter. But sometimes, the brighter the flame, the shorter it burns. It was that smile that caught the eye of a casting agent, leading to the role that would define his life. A young version of Will Smith in The Fresh Prince of Bel-Air. When the episode aired in 1992, audiences saw more than a child actor. They saw a reflection of youth, of joy, of the hopeful version of Will before fame hardened him. Floyd became a symbol of everything the show stood for: laughter, family, and second chances. But Hollywood, as it always does, moved on. After The Fresh Prince, Floyd was cast in The Jacksons, an American dream, playing a young Marlon Jackson, another uncanny fit. The performance was praised, yet the attention faded just as quickly. There were no major offers after that. The same casting offices that once called him every week stopped calling altogether. As the years passed, Floyd's name slipped quietly through the cracks of an industry obsessed with the next face, the next sensation. By 2000, his final on-screen appearance in Young Americans would mark the end of a brief but luminous career. Off-camera, the silence was deafening. He was no longer the boy who made the world smile. He was just another man trying to find meaning beyond applause. People close to him recall a deep kindness, a man who cared more about lifting others than chasing fame. He became a father, a mentor, a quiet presence at local community centers. But behind that gentle nature, there was also a battle won with the shadow of what could have been. Friends would later say that Floyd struggled to reconcile the boy he once was with the man he had become. Hollywood had given him an identity too early and taken it away too soon. When asked in an old, rarely seen interview what he missed most about acting, Floyd smiled faintly and said, "Not the cameras. I miss believing I could be anything." It was a line that hinted at something fragile beneath the surface, a soul that had tasted fame but found it bitter. By his 30s, Floyd reinvented himself as a community leader, founding the Fellowship Men's Group, an organization dedicated to helping men lead, heal, and thrive. It was his attempt to transform personal pain into purpose, but destiny had other plans. Unknown to most, Floyd had already suffered 2 heart attacks before 2025. Each one left scars deeper than the doctors could see. Yet he continued working, smiling, showing up perhaps for others more than himself. On the morning of the 29th of October, 2025, just hours after speaking to his mother, Floyd's heart gave out for the final time. The boy who once played a young Will Smith was gone. And suddenly Hollywood remembered too late. Photos flooded social media, clips resurfaced from old VHS recordings, and the same industry that had forgotten him began to mourn. But the question remains, Why did Floyd disappear from the screen he once lit up? And what truth did he carry with him all these years? The next chapter of his story reveals not just the child actor, but the man he became when no one was watching. Floyd Roger Myers Jr. grew up in Washington, D.C., in a neighborhood where dreams were both currency and escape. His childhood was a mix of streetlight laughter and late-night worries, the kind that come from growing up in a home where love was abundant but money never was. His mother, Denise Myers, worked long hours at a local hospital, while his father, a jazz musician who drifted in and out of the picture, left behind a love for rhythm that Floyd carried in his bones. Even as a child, he saw the world differently. He had that rare awareness, the kind that made him stare too long at people's faces, as if trying to read the stories behind their eyes. His teachers often said, "Floyd doesn't just listen, he absorbs." At just 6, he was already performing for neighbors, mimicking television characters with eerie accuracy. His mother once told a reporter, he never wanted toys, he wanted an audience. But beneath that brightness was a quiet loneliness. In interviews much later, Floyd would recall feeling like he had to be the man of the house far too young. When other kids played basketball after school, he walked his little cousins home, helped his mother fold laundry, and tried to keep the peace in a world that often seemed ready to collapse. Then, by sheer chance, opportunity knocked. A local talent scout came to his elementary school looking for young performers for a TV pilot. Floyd auditioned without even telling his mom. He came home that afternoon with a note that would change his life. "We'd like to see Floyd again. He's got something." That something was what casting directors later called natural presence. He didn't act, he was. In front of a camera, he came alive. After a few commercials and small roles, he landed an audition that would define him. The part of young Will Smith for an episode of The Fresh Prince of Bel-Air. Will himself, then at the height of his stardom, reportedly smiled after watching Floyd's tape and said, "That kid's got my spark." When the episode aired in 1992, Floyd was just 9 years old. Dressed in oversized clothes, with that same grin that made audiences melt, he captured hearts instantly. For millions, he was the little version of the prince, pure charm, pure promise. The show's success made him a minor celebrity overnight. People stopped his mother in grocery stores. Letters arrived from fans across the country. And like so many child actors, the world became too big too fast. Hollywood was both a dream and a trap. Floyd's family suddenly found themselves juggling contracts, auditions, and constant travel. He was flown to Los Angeles for promotional shoots, introduced to other young stars, and even considered for a small, recurring role, one that, for reasons never made public, never materialized. Behind the scenes, though, the glamour had a cost. His mother struggled to keep her job back home while accompanying him to sets. Floyd missed school often. The pressure of balancing fame and family began to take its toll. Then came the Jacksons, an American dream, the next big opportunity. Playing a young Marlon Jackson, Floyd proved he wasn't a one-hit wonder. His timing, energy, and emotional depth were beyond his age. Critics called him one to watch. But again, fate stepped in. The show came and went, and the calls slowed down. By the time Floyd hit his teenage years, the industry that once promised him everything had moved on to newer faces. The silence was confusing. One day he was surrounded by cameras. The next, he was just another kid walking through DC streets with a backpack and no plan. His mother tried to protect him, reminding him, "You were loved because you were real, not because you were famous." But fame is a strange ghost once it leaves. It haunts the spaces it once filled. In later years, Floyd described that period as like being invisible again, but now knowing what it felt like to be seen. He poured himself into art, drawing and writing stories. He loved cameras, not for fame anymore, but for truth. There's a surviving note in his old notebook, found after his death, that reads, "Maybe I'll tell stories from behind the lens someday." It was perhaps the first glimpse of the visual artist he wanted to become. His friends said Floyd was always the quiet leader. He helped younger kids in his neighborhood with homework, talked them out of fights, and spent weekends filming silly short videos on borrowed VHS cameras. It wasn't Hollywood anymore, but it was pure. Those who knew him then remember a boy who was already carrying the weight of an adult. He'd seen how fame could fade, how people could disappear when the lights went off. It taught him empathy and a strange kind of peace. That peace, however, would later be tested by heartbreak, loss, and illness. For now, the boy from DC had grown into a young man who still believed he could create even if the world wasn't watching. But Hollywood has a long memory for fame and an even longer silence for those it forgets. Hollywood, for all its glitter, is a machine that never stops moving, and Floyd Roger Myers Jr. entered it just as it was accelerating into a new age of television. The early 1,990 seconds were overflowing with rising stars, multicultural sitcoms, and the promise of a more diverse entertainment world. For a young black actor with natural charisma and emotional depth, the timing should have been perfect. But timing, as Floyd would later learn, isn't always destiny. After his breakout as young Will Smith in The Fresh Prince of Bel-Air, his name appeared on casting sheets across Los Angeles. His tapes circulated among producers at NBC and CBS. He was described as a natural, warm, bright, and uncoached in the best way. It seemed that every door was opening. Then came his next major role, The Jacksons, An American Dream. The miniseries was a cultural event, a sweeping, emotional retelling of the legendary family's rise to fame. Floyd, playing young Marlon Jackson, appeared in only a handful of scenes, but his energy stood out. In one interview from 1993, the director recalled, "He didn't just play Marlon, he became him. The way he moved, the spark in his eyes, it was uncanny. We all thought he'd be huge." For a moment, it looked like that prophecy might come true. Floyd began appearing at industry mixers and youth acting workshops. Magazines like Right On and Jett mentioned his name in small columns beside other rising talents. He was invited to screen tests for Disney Channel and even read for a supporting role in Family Matters. But the industry is fickle, especially for child actors who are too mature for their age and not quite marketable enough by Hollywood's narrow standards. As Floyd hit his teenage years, the same faces that had adored him at 9 now found him harder to place. He wasn't a cute kid anymore, and he wasn't yet a leading man. He was trapped in the most dangerous gap in show business, the forgotten middle. That gap swallowed countless young actors of the 90 seconds, and Floyd was no exception. Roles stopped coming. His agent changed focus. Calls weren't returned. By 15, he was back home in Washington, far from the sets that had once felt like home. In those years, Floyd faced what many former child stars face, a quiet identity crisis. He enrolled in local acting workshops, worked part-time jobs, and tried to fit into a normal teenage life. But fame has a way of echoing, even after it fades. Classmates would recognize him in the hallways and whisper, "That's the kid from Fresh Prince." Some admired him, others mocked him. Either way, he could never escape the ghost of who he used to be. He started writing music and poetry mostly about dreams, failure, and the strange ache of being forgotten. A few of his handwritten verses still circulate online among fans, one of which reads, "They love your light until it burns their eyes, then they call you gone." He also developed an obsession with film cameras, spending weekends capturing city streets, faces, and movement, experimenting with light and perspective. Friends later said he'd been planning to go to film school, but never found the money or the right opportunity. Hollywood, however, wasn't done with him entirely. In 2000, he was called back for a minor guest appearance in the TV series Young Americans. It wasn't a starring role, but it felt like a sign, a chance to reconnect with the dream. Yet, that episode would quietly become his last on-screen appearance. No one knew it at the time, not even Floyd. After filming Wrapped, he told a co-star, "I think I'm done chasing. I just want to make things that mean something. Is say prepared in the sayings and the sang prepared. And it deasing rebraying." And he did, just not in the way anyone expected. He drifted away from Hollywood's spotlight and into something quieter, but more profound. In his 20s, he began volunteering at youth centers, teaching storytelling and acting to kids who'd never had the chance he did. He wanted them to understand the difference between being seen and being known. Those who met him during this time describe him as gentle but distant, a man haunted by potential. He'd smile easily but deflect any question about the old days. One friend remembered him saying, "I don't miss the fame. I miss believing that it mattered." That single sentence, in hindsight, feels like a key to everything that came next. In his 30s, Floyd tried to channel that longing into purpose. He founded the Fellowship Men's Group, dedicated to helping men heal from trauma, addiction, and generational wounds. He often spoke about how society expects men to carry everything, even silence. It was there, away from cameras and applause, that Floyd finally seemed to find peace. Photos from that period show him surrounded by smiling faces, fathers, sons, friends, building something far more lasting than fame. But under that calm exterior, a silent battle was brewing. Years of emotional strain, perhaps untreated health issues, began to take their toll. Floyd started experiencing heart problems, a cruel irony for a man whose greatest gift had always been his heart. He survived 2 heart attacks before his 40 seconds. Doctors warned him to slow down, but he refused to stop helping others. "I'm finally doing something that matters," he reportedly told a close friend. Then came the third and final one. On the 29th of October 2025, Floyd Roger Myers Jr. passed away quietly in his home in Maryland. His mother said their last conversation was full of laughter. Hours later, he was gone. When news broke, tributes flooded the internet. Will Smith's fan forums filled with childhood clips, and former co-stars expressed heartbreak at the loss of a soul too pure for Hollywood. It was the tragic close to a story that began with so much promise and ended with a silence only broken by memory. There was a moment in time, brief, blinding, and almost mythic, when Floyd Roger Myers Jr. stood at the very edge of greatness. For a child actor, that moment can feel like eternity. For Floyd, it was the summer of 1992, when The Fresh Prince of Bel-Air wasn't just a hit sitcom, it was a cultural revolution. That season, the show was everywhere. Magazine covers, talk shows, merchandise aisles. Will Smith had become the face of a new generation, and Floyd, as the younger Will, became part of that legacy. The episode in which he appeared, the flashback to Will's childhood in Philadelphia, struck audiences in a way the producers didn't expect. Viewers saw in Floyd's performance a raw innocence, a mirror to Will's pain and pride before fame. That night, the ratings soared. Letters poured into NBC from fans asking, "Who's that little kid playing Will?" He had no formal training. He didn't come from an acting dynasty. But Floyd had what casting agents called the camera truth. When he looked into the lens, you didn't see a child actor pretending you saw a child living. His mother would later recall that day at the studio. He wasn't nervous. He just wanted to make everyone laugh. He thought it was a game. That game changed everything. Within months, he was flown to California for meetings, lunches, screen tests. Reporters wanted to know who this kid from Washington, D.C. was. A short feature in Jett magazine dubbed him the boy who made Will Smith smile. Then came The Jacksons, An American Dream. The miniseries was ambitious, an emotional, sprawling chronicle of the Jackson family, their struggles, their genius, and the heavy cost of fame. Floyd's role as young Marlon Jackson demanded something far more mature than his years. He had to embody joy, jealousy, and heartbreak, the endless competition among brothers, the desperate need for love and attention. The performance was quiet but unforgettable. Critics noted that his energy reminded them of a young Michael Jackson himself, playful one moment, pensive the next. "That boy's got rhythm in his soul," one crew member told Variety after the premiere. For a brief, shining window, Floyd was everywhere, appearing at press junkets beside the other young actors, attending small red carpet events with his mother, and even making guest appearances on local talk shows. He was the kind of talent casting directors kept on their lists for years. But Hollywood has an unspoken rule. It loves potential more than permanence. And for every child actor lifted into the light, 1,000 more fade quietly into the background. By 1994, Floyd's momentum began to slow. His voice was changing, his look evolving, and the scripts that once fit him no longer did. The studios that once promised new projects moved on. Still, for those few years, he lived the dream most could only imagine. He attended fan conventions, met other young stars, including a teenage Raven Simone and Alfonso Ribeiro, and built friendships that would last for decades. Photos from that era show a boy grinning beside the Fresh Prince cast, unaware that the world he adored would soon forget him. But the memory of that early fame would never leave him. In one of his later social media posts, Floyd reflected, "When I was a kid, the lights made me feel seen. As a man, I learned to see without the lights." It was a line that captured everything his fans would come to feel: pride, sadness, and the quiet ache of knowing how short brilliance can last. He often spoke fondly of Will Smith, calling him the blueprint of what I wanted to be. Not famous, just fearless. Though they never reunited publicly, Floyd credited Will's mentorship from afar as the reason he stayed grounded. His peak years might have been fleeting, but they left a mark. Generations of Fresh Prince fans would remember his face even decades later, even if they couldn't recall his name. That's the paradox of Hollywood. It gives you immortality, but not always identity. When asked years later if he ever wished for a comeback, Floyd simply said, "Maybe I never left. Maybe I just changed stages." It was the kind of line only someone who had lived through the fragile magic of fame could deliver. His rise wasn't about money or accolades. He never won awards, never headlined blockbusters, but he earned something deeper, a place in the shared nostalgia of millions. Every rerun of The Fresh Prince of Bel-Air carried his presence like a quiet echo, the child who embodied hope before the world turned cynical. That's the beauty and cruelty of stardom. You shine, and the audience moves on, but the light never truly goes out. It lingers, flickering in memory, long after the applause ends. For Floyd, that light would become both blessing and burden. Because once the world has loved you, it's hard to believe it ever could forget. And yet, it did. By the early 2000s, his name was gone from the casting lists, replaced by a new wave of young talent. But the boy who once stood beneath Hollywood's brightest lights wasn't finished yet. His story was far from over. It was just shifting into the shadows, where the real fight would begin. Fame fades quietly. It doesn't end with applause, it ends with silence. For Floyd Roger Myers Jr., that silence began around the year 2001, when the casting calls stopped and the cameras went dark. At first, it must have felt temporary. Everyone told him, "You'll be back." But Hollywood has a cruel way of moving forward without looking back. At 18, Floyd was no longer the cute kid. He was a young man standing in the ruins of a dream. His old agent stopped answering. Scripts he auditioned for never led to callbacks. He'd gone from being recognized by strangers to being ignored by producers. And that sudden invisibility, that's what breaks most child stars. Not failure, but being forgotten. He returned to Washington, D.C., and tried to live a normal life. But what is normal when you've already touched fame? He enrolled in college, took photography classes, and started experimenting with short films. Yet, deep down, the ache remained that unspoken question. What happened to me? People who knew Floyd in those years said he struggled with depression and identity. One former classmate recalled, "He used to talk about being two people, the one the world loved, and the one the world never saw." That fracture haunted him. And then came the health problems. In his mid-30s, Floyd began to experience fatigue and chest pain. Doctors diagnosed early signs of cardiovascular disease, rare for a man his age, but not uncommon for someone who had spent years under stress, sleeplessness, and emotional strain. Still, he refused to slow down. He had a new mission, helping others heal. In 2018, he founded the Fellowship Men's Group, a grassroots organization aimed at helping men face trauma, addiction, and loneliness. In his own words, "We're not here to pretend we're strong. We're here to remember that we're human." The irony was cruel. The man who dedicated his life to healing others was quietly breaking inside. By 2022, Floyd suffered his first heart attack. Friends said it terrified him, but he recovered and returned to work within weeks. The second came a year later, more severe, leaving him hospitalized for several days. Still, he insisted on leading meetings, counseling men from his bedside, and posting motivational clips online. There was one particular clip, now haunting in retrospect, where he said, "When you survive something that should have taken you out, you start to wonder if you're still here for a reason." He smiled, but his eyes carried the exhaustion of someone who had seen too much. In those final years, Floyd spoke more openly about fame, not with bitterness, but melancholy. Hollywood teaches you to chase the next thing, but real life teaches you to stay still long enough to hear yourself think. He had finally found a kind of peace. He was a father of four, a mentor to many, and a man who'd built purpose from pain. But beneath that calm exterior, his heart, both literal and emotional, was giving out. On the morning of the 29th of October 2025, Floyd called his mother, Denise. They talked about his kids, about dinner plans, about how tired he felt lately. She told him to rest. He laughed and said, "Don't worry, Ma. I'm good." A few hours later, he was gone. The news broke quietly, first through local Maryland outlets, then across social media. When larger media caught on, the story hit like a gut punch. Former Fresh Prince of Bel-Air child actor found dead at 42. For millions who had grown up watching the show, it felt surreal. That boy, the one frozen in time, forever running down the sitcom hallway, was gone. In the days that followed, tributes poured in. Fans dug up VHS clips and early interviews. Co-stars and producers described him as gentle, grounded, and unforgettable. Even Will Smith's old colleagues commented online, writing, Floyd had something pure. Hollywood wasn't ready for his kind of light, and made Don his Lubri, but as the tributes faded, questions began to surface. Why had he left acting so suddenly? Why had no one heard of him for decades? And how could someone so young, so healthy-looking, die of heart failure? Some speculated about genetic conditions. Others whispered about stress, anxiety, the invisible toll of child fame. But the truth is simpler and sadder. Floyd carried a heart that gave more than it received. He was the kind of person who healed others, but never truly healed himself. One former friend put it this way. He'd walk into a room and fix everyone's problems except his own. He just ran out of energy. It's the kind of tragedy Hollywood doesn't film, the quiet kind. The kind that doesn't make headlines but breaks hearts just the same. Today, the house where Floyd passed away is still filled with his art sketches, cameras, photographs. One of his final images, reportedly taken just weeks before his death, was a self-portrait reflected in a broken mirror. The caption he wrote underneath read, "Sometimes the cracks are the most honest part." In that single line lies the mystery of Floyd Roger Myers Jr. The boy who once reflected another man's childhood, Will Smith's, ended up reflecting our own fragility instead. He showed the world what happens when the light of fame fades but the soul keeps searching. And in that search, he became something greater than a forgotten actor. He became a mirror of the human condition. The tragedy of Floyd Roger Myers Jr. isn't just that he died young, it's that so few ever got to see the man he became. In the quiet years that followed his fading fame, Floyd Roger Myers Jr. transformed from a forgotten actor into something far rarer, a man at peace with imperfection. He no longer chased roles or auditions. Instead, he chased meaning. By his late 30s, Floyd's home in Maryland had become a sanctuary. Walls lined with black and white photographs he'd taken himself. Candid shots of strangers, laughing children, and sunlight caught between buildings. He once wrote that photography was his way of capturing the moments no one claps for. That sentence summed him up. While others were obsessed with recognition, Floyd was learning to honor silence. His health, however, was becoming a battle he couldn't ignore. After 2 heart attacks, he began documenting his recovery process online, not for sympathy, but for awareness. He posted clips about stress, diet, and the mental health struggles that men rarely discuss. He talked openly about how fame as a child had left him unprepared for life's ordinary hardships. When you're famous too young, he said in one video, you learn applause before you learn peace. That honesty drew thousands of followers who saw in him not a celebrity, but a survivor. They called him Brother Floyd, a name he embraced with humility. The Fellowship Men's Group, which he co-founded, became his legacy in motion. Meetings were held in community centers and coffee shops, safe spaces for men to share what society told them to hide. Floyd led with compassion, not ego. He listened more than he spoke, often ending meetings with his quiet mantra, "You can't heal what you won't name." Those close to him remember that even when his energy waned, he never canceled a session. He'd arrive pale and tired, sometimes holding his chest mid-conversation, but smile and say, "I'm good, brother. Let's talk." The group saved lives, but it couldn't save his. In the months before his death, Floyd's friends noticed subtle changes. He spoke more about legacy, more about his children, and less about the future. One of his last journal entries, found by his mother, read simply, "If I go early, let them know I was finally happy." And by all accounts, he was. He had found purpose where most people only find regret. He was reconnecting with his kids, rebuilding old friendships, and quietly mentoring young creatives who reminded him of himself. On the 28th of October, 2025, the night before he passed, Floyd attended an online fellowship meeting. The topic that evening was forgiveness. He spoke softly, almost prophetically, about letting go of guilt, about the art of leaving peace behind. "We're all stories," he said. "The trick is to end yours with love." Those were among his final public words. The next morning, he called his mother to tell her he was feeling fine. Hours later, he suffered a massive cardiac arrest in his home. When paramedics arrived, it was too late. The world lost him quietly. No headlines, no breaking news banners, just a single ripple that grew into waves as fans rediscovered who he was. His funeral was small but beautiful. Friends, family, and members of fellowship gathered to read poetry, sing hymns, and share stories. One of his sons, barely a teenager, stood up and said, My dad used to say hearts don't break, they expand. Even in death, Floyd was still teaching others how to heal. The boy who once carried Will Smith's legacy had built one of his own, quieter, smaller, but just as meaningful. His life didn't end with applause. It ended with peace. But peace doesn't erase mystery. Because in every great story, even the calmest endings leave echoes. And Floyd's final months still raise one haunting question. Did he know it was coming? When the news of Floyd Roger Myers Jr.'s death began to spread, it didn't crash through the media like a scandal, it drifted through it like a memory. His name, once printed in casting calls and credits, appeared again on timelines, tribute pages, and nostalgic fan threads. The world whispered his name, not in gossip but in gratitude. Clips of his Fresh Prince of Bel-Air appearance resurfaced on TikTok and YouTube. One moment in particular, that wide, radiant smile as he ran through the Philadelphia neighborhood flooded social media with tears and comments. I remember that kid. In that instant, the boy who had once been forgotten was remembered by millions. But Floyd's legacy didn't live in nostalgia alone. It lived in the quiet revolutions he sparked long after the cameras stopped rolling. Through the Fellowship Men's Group, his voice reached people the industry had never cared to see: working fathers, veterans, young men struggling with depression and purpose. He turned his own invisibility into a mirror that helped others confront theirs. In a society that often silenced male vulnerability, Floyd's openness became an act of rebellion. He didn't preach like a celebrity. He spoke like a brother. "You're not broken," he told one crowd. "You're just unhealed. There's a difference." That simple phrase went viral weeks after his death, printed on shirts, murals, and social media posts under the hashtag #HealLikeFloyd. In Hollywood, former co-stars and industry peers began to speak about the need for mental health resources for former child actors, a cause Floyd had championed privately for years. His story became a case study in what happens when early fame isn't matched with lifelong care. He wasn't just a symbol of what's lost when fame fades. He became a lesson in what can be found when one chooses purpose over spotlight. Culturally, Floyd's life redefined what it means to make it. In a world obsessed with success, measured in views and awards, his quiet evolution challenged the narrative. He proved that healing is also a legacy, one that doesn't need a red carpet to shine. For his family, that legacy became something sacred. His children now carry forward his message, with the oldest launching a mentorship program in his honor. "Dad believed healing was contagious," his son said during a memorial event. "So we're going to keep spreading it." Even years after his passing, fans continued to discover his story not through Hollywood reruns, but through the echoes of his compassion. Writers have begun calling him the forgotten healer of Hollywood, a poetic title that feels painfully accurate. And perhaps that is where his true power lies. Floyd Roger Myers Jr. didn't leave behind blockbuster films or million-dollar estates. He left something harder to find: an afterglow of kindness. In every person who watched him as a child and every man he helped as an adult, there remains a trace of his quiet strength. The tragedy of Floyd's life wasn't that he faded from fame. It was that it took his death for the world to realize how bright he still was. Like the characters he once portrayed, Floyd's story became a reflection of something universal: the pursuit of belonging, the cost of silence, and the fragile line between being seen and being known. He entered Hollywood as a child who imitated Will Smith, but he left life as a man who embodied something much greater: empathy, resilience, and grace. His light may have dimmed, but in the soft glow of memory, it never truly went out. Because legends don't always roar. Sometimes they whisper, and the echo lasts forever. There's something haunting about the story of Floyd Roger Myers Jr., not just because of how it ended, but because of how quietly it was lived. Hollywood loves a comeback. It celebrates redemption when the lights turn back on. But Floyd's life was about something deeper: finding redemption when the world stops looking. At Celebrity Forgotten, we often explore the rise and fall of icons, the glitter, the scandal, the tragedy. But Floyd's story doesn't fit neatly into any of those boxes. His life wasn't a scandal. It wasn't a collapse. It was a slow transformation, a boy who once belonged to the screen learning, painfully, to belong to himself. When he was a child, the camera loved him. When he was an adult, the world forgot him. And somewhere between those two extremes, Floyd built a life filled with meaning, kindness, and truth. Maybe that's why his death feels so heavy. It's not just the loss of a performer, it's the loss of a soul who finally figured out what mattered most. There's a cruel irony in how Hollywood treats people like Floyd. We remember the characters, not the human beings behind them. We remember the child actor, not the man who grows up and struggles to make sense of his reflection. Fame gives visibility, but not identity. And when it's gone, people like Floyd are left with a void so large it echoes for years. But Floyd filled that void differently. He chose to give, to teach, to heal. He turned his heartbreak into a mission that outlived him, something not every actor can claim. If you think about it, that's the real miracle. He didn't let Hollywood's silence define him. He wrote his own ending, one that traded applause for authenticity. And in a strange, poetic way, he might have found something more eternal than fame. Because fame fades, healing doesn't. The lesson Floyd leaves us with is painfully clear. What you do after the spotlight might matter more than anything you do under it. He reminded us that every forgotten name once belonged to someone who dreamed, someone who gave everything they had to be seen, even just once. It's easy to mourn the tragedy of his early death, but maybe it's better to celebrate the courage of his rebirth. The way he turned the ashes of a Hollywood childhood into the fire of a purpose-driven adulthood. The way he proved that you don't need a camera to illuminate lives. In the end, Floyd Roger Myers Jr. didn't die as the kid from the Fresh Prince. He died as a father, a mentor, a builder of community, a man who taught others to love themselves when the world refused to. That's not just a legacy, that's transcendence. And perhaps that's why, decades from now, when people scroll through forgotten faces of the 1,990 seconds, his will stand out not because of what he achieved, but because of what he became. So maybe this isn't a tragedy after all. Maybe it's a story about transformation, about how even the smallest spark can light a path through the darkest night. Because Floyd's story doesn't end with death. It ends with connection, with the people he touched, the men he helped heal, the children who now grow up, knowing their father's story wasn't about fame, it was about faith. He proved that even if you're forgotten by the world, your light can still find its way home. And for that reason, Floyd Roger Myers Jr. is not a footnote in Hollywood's history. He's a reminder of its humanity. The camera fades to black. The laughter from the Fresh Prince of Bel-Air echoes faintly, like a memory trapped in a rerun from another lifetime. There he is, Floyd Roger Myers Jr., forever 9 years old, running through that Philadelphia street, eyes full of light, unaware that he's already living the most unforgettable moment of his life. Time has a way of softening everything. The applause, the pain, even the faces we thought we'd never forget. But every once in a while, someone like Floyd returns in a flash of memory, and the heart remembers. It remembers the child who once made the world smile, the man who tried to heal what fame had broken, the father who left behind not just children, but a purpose. It's strange how easily Hollywood forgets. And yet, it's even stranger how deeply we remember. Because the truth is, Floyd never really vanished. He just changed stages. He went from the studio lights of Burbank to the quiet glow of Maryland mornings, from the applause of strangers to the gratitude of those he saved. And maybe that's the closest thing to peace any of us can hope for. The world didn't give him a grand ending. No farewell tour, no final role, but he didn't need one. His greatest performance was the one nobody saw, the act of living gently in a world that only claps for noise. In the end, Floyd's story isn't just about what was lost, it's about what was found. He found grace in obscurity. He found strength in vulnerability. He found truth in silence. And now, somewhere beyond the bright lights and broken promises of fame, perhaps that little boy from the Fresh Prince is smiling again, free, seen, and finally understood. Because some stories were never meant to be loud. Some were meant to whisper. And Floyd's whisper still lingers. Some stories were never meant to be known. But now, you know.